Welcome to Beyond the Battlefield, the exclusive podcast of the Canadian Institute for Military and Veteran Health Research. Each week, we meet with leading researchers and people with lived experience to discuss issues affecting military, veterans, and families. Join us as we unpack the findings to bridge the gap between military, veteran, and family health research and real-world impact. In today's episode, we sit down with Dr. Dannielle Post and Dr. Marg Rogers to discuss family care partners and family programs and resources. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode. As you listen to this podcast, feel free to leave feedback in the comments section below. Did you learn something new? Do you have something to share about the topics discussed? At the end of this podcast, we also invite you to complete a short survey by clicking on the survey link in the podcast description section. Your input helps us create content that's valuable to you. Dr. Dannielle Post is the Program Director of the Bachelor of Health Science Public Health at the University of South Australia. Dannielle conducts research and teaching within the field of public health, including health promotion, determinants of health, and program design, implementation, and evaluation. Her research investigates the physical and psychological health and well-being of family carers, in particular, family care partners of veterans. Dannielle has been involved in a number of studies assessing the physical and psychological well-being and support needs of carers of veterans and the effectiveness of UniSA's Invictus Pathways program. Dr. Marg Rogers is a senior lecturer of early childhood education at the University of New England and a postdoctoral fellow with the Commonwealth government-funded Mana Institute that aims to improve the mental health of regional, rural, and remote communities. Marg is a participatory and narrative researcher who researches with lived experience community members. As a children's author, she weaves these narratives into research-based storybooks for children to provide a springboard for discussions with parents, educators, and family workers about difficult topics, such as parents working away and those with service-related physical and mental health conditions. Specifically, she researches ways to support the well-being of military, first responder, and remote worker families. As the lead for the Children's Family Resilience Programs team, Marg has worked to co-design and co-create award-winning online free early intervention support for potentially vulnerable children from defense, veteran, first responder, and remote worker families. Hi, Dr. Rogers and Dr. Post. Thank you for joining us today on the Beyond the Battlefield podcast to discuss your research and the impact on military families. As you know, we are doing an entire series dedicated to military families with this podcast, and we've included guests from a diverse background, perspectives, and research backgrounds. So as a starting question for both of you, can you touch on your views of the current state of military family research, including some of the focus of your own research?
My area is looking at children and how they are in military families and what they experience in military families, especially if they are in a veteran family or in a family that's currently serving. Both are very important to our area of research. We look at the impacts of military service of the parent, and we also look at ways to support and resource those families, so including the children. And I would say that it's a growing field in Australia, but it's still a very, very niche field. So there's not many military family researchers at all in our country, but luckily it is a growing field. And I think it's an exciting time because we've got some big things happening in Australia. We've got a Royal Commission into defence and veteran suicide because of the huge issue in that area. And I think it's exciting because it means that finally it's getting some media attention, and that means that people are more likely to be talking about it and be interested in it. And we're hoping that translates into more people researching in the area and more funds may be allocated to both research and resourcing these families.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that overview. Dr. Post, can you share some of your research?
Of course, I think Marg has explained that beautifully, actually, in terms of what's happening in Australia, and absolutely perfectly right that we are coming into a really interesting time. Our research looks very much at the family perspective from the perspective of what we would term the family care partner, but is essentially the family carer. It's the person who sort of provides that day-to-day, daily living support to a veteran. And we started by looking at relationships between their physical and psychological well-being, and also looking at the emotional and practical supports that family carers need and the family unit needs, and how we go about supporting them to find those or to have access to them.
And we'll talk a lot more about that as we go on through this episode. I'm interested, Dr. Rogers, you mentioned that there's not a lot of researchers in the military family space. And it's interesting because that ties to a previous episode we recorded with Dr. Tamsito and Dr. Norris, who mentioned that they were surprised that Canada was kind of lagging behind in family research on military families. So it seems like that was kind of a similar experience within Australia as well.
Absolutely. So it was really funny the way I got into this research topic. My PhD actually looked at the experiences of young children when their parent deploys. And at the time, my area is actually creative arts, and I was going to do a doctorate on something in the creative arts, dance, in fact. And I was asked just to write a charity book for somebody, a little personal book for a particular family who was struggling with some of the things that happen to a family when a parent deploys. And the young children were having problems. And I got talking to the parents, and it all sounded terribly familiar to me because I'd had an uncle who had deployed to Vietnam and grown up with cousins who had experienced many of those things that the families were talking about. And I said, look at what's been researched in Australia. And I suddenly found that actually nobody had talked to the children. They had talked to parents, and there had been a bit of research there, but nobody had talked to the children and their educators. And I'm from an education background. So for me, that was the part that I wanted to untangle. What do the children understand? What do they experience? How do the educators support them? How do the parents support them? And what can we do to support them better? And to me, that was just fascinating that really nothing had been done. So that's sort of where it's at. And since then, there have been other people that have come on board and just started, but it's really scratching the surface.
Let's talk about that a little bit more. Children in parental families. I think there's a lot of research out there now talking about how children are impacted by parental service. Can you describe some of the research on the impact on children?
Yeah, sure. So they're impacted by frequent relocations. And that doesn't necessarily only mean military. It can also mean other types of service families, such as your PSB families, or we would say first responder families. So that can impact their education, their friendship, their level of support, or what we call protective factors. And it can also impact other things like extracurricular activities, like they might pick up soccer in one town, but in the next town, they don't do soccer. They do a different type of sport, or start guitar when they're about 8, but no, the next town doesn't have a guitar teacher. So it's just that constant changing. As the families are relocating all the time, there's increased levels of family stress that relocations just naturally create. And this can even mean economic costs, because it could be that the non-military spouse in the family or the non-military parent had a really good job in this location, but they're really struggling to get work that is what they are used to or what they're skilled at in another location. Another way that they're impacted when their parents work away is they can struggle to understand what's happening in the family. And so that can cause all sorts of emotional outbursts or physical responses because they're just not sure what's going on. Suddenly the parent disappears. Even a baby understands that you take away a parent and they're just not there anymore. So someone who was providing love and support has just disappeared. And the other thing is that children are present-oriented. So it means that anything that's yesterday, today, and tomorrow is on their radar. But if they're young children, trying to explain that mum or dad has gone away for 3 months, that's really, really difficult for them to understand. So in my research, I found that children often misunderstood. They might have had a parent that had been away in Afghanistan for 9 months. The parent came back, had a bit of time off, went back to the base one day just for a day work and day shift. And suddenly the child's melting down just as much as they did when they went to Afghanistan, because of course the child doesn't relate those differences necessarily. The parent's just leaving the house again, and for them it's all the same. So I found that they typically had 4 types of responses, and that fits with the literature. These can be physical responses like toileting, feeding, that type of thing, those skills. Social, meaning being able to fit into a routine and being able to separate from a parent to go to childcare or to go to school. And then emotional responses, the way that they can emotionally respond to something, whether they're throwing a tantrum or whether they are being able to control their emotions a little bit more. And also cognitively, just that understanding, that focus, that attention. They can be quite distracted when parents are away. The last area where they're impacted is that they're often the silent victims of parental service trauma. And that's because despite parents' best efforts to shield their children, and parents are naturally protective, they don't want that trauma to go to their child, it just tends to seep through. And that's what we call vicarious trauma. And that's due to things that they see, things they overhear. Even if parents are super careful, they pick up on what's happening. Or sometimes if they're not told, they imagine. And sometimes that imagination can be even worse than what actually did happen. So they can also pick up because the parent who has experienced the behaviour is bringing that stress and their behaviour has changed, and that's sort of infiltrating the home.
That is fascinating. One thing I'm reminded of is a conversation that I had personally with a Canadian Armed Forces veterans and a spouse who mentioned that they had a younger daughter, and when the daughter's dad went to Ottawa on a day trip, it created such an emotional response. And it's interesting to hear you talk about that within the literature and that separation of being able to understand whether it's a overseas mission to Afghanistan or a trip to Ottawa for work. I'm going to turn it over now and talking a bit about the parents. You mentioned we know that family members can play multiple different roles. So one is about trying to care for the children and minimize the impacts of parental service, whether that works or not is hard to understand. But family members play multiple different roles, and one of them being a family care partner, which Dr. Post you mentioned originally. Can you describe a little bit more about what a family care partner is and the research that's being done in this area?
Yeah, the use of the family care partner term was something that we didn't want to label people, but at the same time, in terms of how we're reporting things, we wanted to understand how family members identified. So what was really interesting is from the study that we did, we asked a question in there. We only had 100 and something people involved in the study, so it wasn't a huge sample size in any way. But we asked what was the term that they most identified with, and a third of them actually said there isn't a term. I'm their spouse or their wife or their partner or their husband. There wasn't that kind of definitive label, but the next one down was care partner. And we sort of thought that reflected a term, at least, that was chosen by a portion of the population. But it reflected that role in that they were a partner in the care, irrespective of whoever else was providing care. And I think it's important to acknowledge that that person doesn't necessarily have to be their partner or a spouse partner in that sense, or someone they're married to or living with. Potentially it could be a parent or an adult child or a brother or a sister or a grandparent even. We do find potentially that it may be a female spouse that is more likely to get involved in the research, but the care partner approach is way beyond that. And we really need to consider the concept of family as it is, because it's not always a family member either. It could be someone who essentially is treated like a family member that is a really, really close friend that they've known for a long, long time. So there's all of these aspects in terms of, we think of a contemporary family as mum, dad, 1.2 kids, a picket fence and a dog kind of thing, but that's not what it's like anymore. And we need to be considerate of that when we're looking at how we support a family and a family care partner more broadly.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of discussion that we've had within Canada about the changing context of what a family looks like and who belongs in a family. And of course, that has individual impacts and changes. That has a lot of political and policy related changes on who would be eligible for various services as a care partner. Some work that you did, Dr. Post, was looking at family care partners and the impact on physical and psychological well-being. Can you touch on some of those findings?
So what we were doing around this was it's in a pilot study format, and we were trying to understand the relationships between people identifying as family carers or family care partners, their psychological well-being, but what that looked like in the context of their physical well-being as well, and things like resilience and those aspects. And what we found was there was a reasonably high proportion of people that were displaying signs of psychological distress, and that there was a relationship between psychological distress and resilience, and also between physical activity and resilience. Some conversations around the fact that people who were more physically active or less sedentary were more likely to be showing that they were more resilient generally. I know there's a lot of discussion around resilience and what that means to different people, and that's a whole new podcast in itself, I think. But there were some really interesting relationships around those aspects, whether that was because people who were able to dedicate more time to their own physical well-being and being able to get out, do things for themselves and go for a walk and do things like that. I did feel better about things. That was definitely potential for that. But yeah, it was a small study, and it led obviously to our broader study where we went on to looking at the emotional practices that people need.
That's fascinating, Dr. Post. I think sometimes we forget that children can actually be carers too. And I love the fact that you said these other people that aren't necessarily the spouse that pop up, and it could be siblings or family friends that become these carers. And what's interesting about the children is becoming a carer that's life-changing and navigating the role of being a carer and trying to be a child, and they don't necessarily go together. And then having this high level of responsibility, but they're still a child with very little power. So it's just counterbalance all the time. And it can also obviously increase their exposure to secondary trauma as well, because they're having more time with the person who's impacted.
It is really interesting. I'd be interested in your perspective from the family carer, non-serving partner. I'm just anecdotally hearing some things from some of our participants where they almost feel a sense of guilt because they know the child is taking on more than they feel they should be and not able to be a kid. But at the same time, it is a support to the family carer, if you like.
And, you know, the human nature too is that when you're caring for someone, if you're a parent, and anecdotally parents say this, they feel like they're taking on almost a parent role themselves to their spouse, who's supposed to be their partner and their lover and their lifelong partner. And it's a very different relationship, but it's human nature not to feel romantically towards someone you're caring for. And so that brings in a whole different part of struggles in those relationships. And some people get therapy and some people navigate it really well. And for some people, it's not an issue, but it can be an issue to turn off that I'm a carer, but now I'm a romantic partner and I'm a lifelong partner with someone. It's a really, really difficult stage.
Yeah, definitely.
It's so interesting having both of you on together because we're talking about supporting families, both together, but also individually, like looking at care partners, whether that's oftentimes the spouse, but also looking at children, the role they can play either directly as an older adult child or maybe indirectly, not really meaning to have that caregiving, physical caregiving. It's interesting. There's so many different identities that one person can hold as this kind of spouse. To their children, they're trying to be a parent. Then they're trying to be a caregiver. They're trying to be a romantic spouse or intimate partner, whatever it might be. How can we support these individuals? Because it sounds like there's a lot of support that might be needed. There's obviously some impact on physical and psychological well-being. There's probably a lot just to understand who they are and their identity and what their roles are day to day. So I'm interested in what both your opinions are, what the research says on supports that are required to meet the needs of family care partners, whether that is adult children or spouses or whoever it might be.
And if I backpedal this a little bit, I think a lot of the things that we see people say that they need, perhaps things that we might say, well, we know lots of people need these things and they don't necessarily have to be a family carer in a veteran family. This might be some of those real practical things around family support or emotional support. We all need that to an extent, but there's a uniqueness about these families. And I think one of the things I found true personally is, firstly, we don't want the veterans to think that they are the cause of all the problems. We don't want to work from a deficit model that every single family that has a military background or experience is in need of help, because we know that that's not the case, because there are families that are thriving. And I think we have a lot to learn from them in terms of how we then support the families who really do need the help. But our experience is the people that need the help need it now, and they need it really badly. And these are the steps that we need to put in place to make sure that these families do get that support. So thinking about things like having access to service, there are a lot of services available. There are programs available. But at 2:00 in the morning, when someone is having a crisis and there's no one that you can call, where do you go? Who do you turn to? And these are some of the things I think we need to be focusing on more so, and taking the positive that we know that people are experiencing and how they are doing things, and then how do we better support the people that need that extra support to do it. So that was probably a bit of a convoluted answer to that question, but I think it's really important to have those caveats in place. Some of the things we see, they are the really practical things. It's that kind of analogy where you're in an aeroplane and the masks drop down. You put your own mask on first before you help anyone else. And one of our carers said that it's like being on the plane, and you've got to look after yourself first, because if they fall over, if they can't do their role, then who looks after the veteran? Who's the person that then provides the support? So making sure that we are supporting those people who do the supporting, and then how we support the family more broadly, I think is a really important approach from what we understand. It's that access to service. It's people knowing where they can find the support. In most cases, there is a need for that individualized, tailored support, but there's some really broad supports that access could be provided to as well. Dr. Rogers was saying before about children moving around and not having access to a support that they might have had in another town when they move to a new place. And the same goes for partners or the spouse. If we're looking at the spouse situation specifically, they might be super qualified in a particular role that's their dream job, and they're moving from place to place. They can't get that role. They maybe don't have the appropriate accreditation in that state that they might have had in another state. You might find the person that they're caring for is not doing particularly well, and they're taking jobs that they're overqualified for and they don't really want to be doing, but they've got an excellent boss who's really understanding of their role. And if they have to leave early or they need to leave in a hurry, they can do that. And sometimes there's that trade-off. So they're not getting their career fulfillment and working in roles they're qualified for so that they're supporting that family role. They might be leaving their family supports behind. So how do we counter all those things? How do we put supports in place to make sure that we are supporting people as best as they can?
I agree. I think sometimes we're often asked questions and it's looking at the views of service family life. There are actually a lot of positives, and we know that the families that I've worked with, both as lived experience, people who are contributing to our programs, but also people who I've collected data from and I've collected their stories from because I'm a narrative researcher. They have so many strengths. And so sometimes it's just reminding them of those strengths and encouraging them and showing them how they're actually tapping into those protective factors or those supports that they already have, or reminding them of those supports. And sometimes it's the generic things, like we have things that help them with parenting, just little ideas. And it's not that they don't have great ideas too, but it's that collective wisdom. Is that, well, this worked for me when my spouse was deployed and I found that this worked with that child, but something else worked with this child. And it's gathering those tips and putting them all together, because when you stress, it's not that you're not a good parent or it's not that you don't know anything. It's that sometimes when you stress, you just can't think. And in that moment, you just know something really quickly. Also, we find with our resources, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, but it's something that brings the children and the parent together. And it can be like a storybook. We gather people's narratives and we put them into a storybook. There's that time together where it can be the veteran and it can be the non-member spouse, and then it can be the child. And having those narratives as a springboard with, okay, what's happening in this story? Oh, and how is that similar or different to what's happening here? It can just be providing them with an opportunity to talk, an opportunity to come together, and also an opportunity to see their lives reflected, something like a story. And that validation, like, oh, I'm not the only one, because often when we're struggling, and it can be about anything, this is a human thing, this is not a military family thing, but when we're struggling, we think that we're the only one going through that. And if we just take off our blinkers and look a bit beyond, there's other people who have been through what we're going through, and we can tap into their wisdom and their knowledge and their support and their encouragement.
I think a few excellent points made about there's caregivers both within military families and outside of a military family. They probably have some similar experiences and some similar programs or services that work for them. Then there's the other military context. We talked about relocation. That's different than many other occupations, right? The frequent relocation and services directed towards that. Dr. Post, this is something we're hearing in Canada too. You mentioned the kind of the 2 a.m. need for support. And this is what we're hearing for families where childcare services, the extended hours, the rush on a weekend or a deployment situation or something where they need that quick access. So these are things where additional context within the military sounds like relocation and kind of urgent needs for some of these services. I know in some of my research on veteran chronic pain, there's the other side of the coin where they see their spouse, the caregiver in this situation, whether they identify them that way or not, doing a lot of these activities of daily living, taking out the garbage, and maybe socially that's their familiar role that they still can't fulfill after releasing from the military, and the challenges on the veteran. So I can only imagine the challenges between family members where they're all kind of feeling this and experiencing it in a different way. That dynamic must be challenging, which goes on, again, bringing some things together to what Dr. Rogers mentioned, is the idea of bringing families together and some of these supports. So Dr. Rogers, can you you highlight on the benefit of that and some of the programs and resources that are out there, and specifically to your work on military children?
So basically, our team have been working to co-create free evidence-based online resources for children that are from military, veteran and first responder or PSP families. And so these resources include a collection of storybooks and interactives that have been co-created using lived experience narratives that we have collected from children and their parents, educators and practitioners. So in order to access those programs, we have what we call personalised programs. It's just basically an online form. Parents or educators or support workers just simply go in and tick a few checkboxes and then work out what it is, what resource they particularly need. And that spits out an instant form, can be either downloaded or just used as a web-based form. And they have the resources there that are all linked. So there's different types of resources. We've got storybooks, and then we've got modules that accompany those. So it's topics that you will specifically find in military families. So we don't talk about toilet training or choosing your first school or something like that. We'll be talking about things that would impact parents and children and those who are supporting these families who are specifically in military, veteran or first responder families. So our age group for the storybooks is 2 to 8 years. But we've got one book that's suitable for up to 12 years. And the storybooks cover topics such as parents working away, attending commemoration services, which is a big part of service families, such as Remembrance Day, we have Anzac Day, and other countries have different special events. And then we also have military family culture in itself, navigating some of the supports within that and tapping into those. And also we look at service-related issues that can crop up in families. So the previous books I've just talked about, they're suitable to read for any families, but then we've got very focused books that are really for families who are going through this. They're not for classroom reading or group reading. They're really therapy books for parents to use with their children or practitioners to use with children they're supporting, that the children would need if they have a parent with an injury, a medical condition, a PTSD, a moral injury, that type of service-related trauma in their family. So alongside all of those storybooks, we have co-created evidence-based modules to support the parents, educators and support workers just to upskill them, because many of the educators that we talk to and I talked to in my PhD studies, they just said, oh, we've just moved here and we don't know anything about military family life. We don't know anything about a veteran. And so it's just upskilling them to help them to find out more about it. And so what we're finding now is that if there are early childhood services or schools that are surrounding areas where there are bases, that they're using them as professional development activities for staff. So obviously when we first created these resources, we were specifically thinking of Australian families, right? So that was what our funding was for. So now we've got this lovely partnership with Simva, and we are culturally adapting the resources to make them suitable for Canadian families and for other families as well. And so the way we're doing that is working with Simva's research team and also their partnership manager and their focus groups that they've created using people with lived experience from families that are either PSD families or military or veteran families. So that gives us input to say what needs changing. Obviously, we might spell things differently, or we might have different animals to put in or different scenery, but culturally, what's going to connect with a child from Canada and what isn't. So we've had to sometimes just adapt very small things, and other times it's a fairly major adaptation because culturally there's similarities, but there's also that uniqueness, which is really lovely. So we're also working with other Canadian organisations, and Simva's got funding through the Royal Canadian Region, and also we're working closely with the Canadian Forces Memorial World Cross Service. We're also providing both cash and in-kind funding for some adaptations of books. And my organisation and the University of New England and the Manor Institute are also providing that in-kind funding to make sure that they're research-based and to make sure that I've got adequate time to make sure the stories and the narratives stay true to what was the original intent, and they still come from that strong education philosophy, which is important for my work as an educational researcher.
That is really interesting, Dr. Rogers. Can I ask, do you have resources around talking to children about things like mental health and PTSD and those kind of things?
Absolutely. So we worked very closely with Legacy Club Services, some of their support workers and some of their clients. And we had fascinating conversations about what do your children need or what would have helped your children who are now much older. And then we also have on our team, we have people who are adult children and veterans. And they talk about what was a common experience for them and what they know their friends, families were common experiences, but what was also a unique experience. So when they're reading these storybooks, which just look like storybooks, right, there's a foreword that has a lot of rich information from someone who is either a practitioner in the field or a researcher in the field or someone with lived experience or a bit of combination of both. And then at the end of the book is the prologue, and that has research-based information written in English. So it's upskilling parents to understand about why the child is reacting the way they are or responding the way they are, and to learn more about how they can tap into supports and learning more about ways they can navigate that space with their child. So the books look incredibly simple, but they're supposed to be an educational experience for everyone involved. They take a lot of work, but they're created with such love. And it's not me, it's the amazing people that we work with. We've got about 24 co-authors. The storybook that we're writing at the moment, that's moral injury. Many Canadians are involved in that and from the UK. And then we take her to pilot the books with families and say, have we got this right? And that can be with young children, but it can be with adult children. And we get these beautiful stories back saying, we've been struggling to explain this for 62 years. And now we can see what could have been, what conversations we could have had. And they ended up sending it to their adult children who have their own children. Now it's helping them to understand why grandpa acts the way he does or something like that. So it's a really rich blend of ideas and common experiences, less common experiences, and ways to navigate that. The books provide coping strategies, ways for the child to navigate that space and understanding that they're not responsible for their parents' behaviour. It's not their fault. It's not something they did, and their parent may or may not be very attentive to them at times. But again, that's about what's happened in the past. It's not about their behaviour.
Such amazing research, and bringing families together and including adult children, I think, is such an important piece. I've heard some family members say that when they went through challenges due to military service, sometimes the children were young and that was almost a blessing in a sense. It was easier. But then they turned 12 or 13 and started asking questions, and they don't know how to speak to the child about what happened to a family member or whatever it might be. So continuation through the lifespan and being able to bring families together with recommendations on how to talk about these topics, I think is critically important. You also mentioned educators, and linking back to a previous episode, we're talking about the changing military families and where they live. I know in Canada, we've seen the closing of a lot of military schools. So now there's less people living on bases. They're living all over. So their children are attending schools, and there's requirement, I guess, of educators to learn more about military families and how to support them. So sounds like there's a lot of value to this.
Absolutely. We love working with the educators. In Australia, we have what's called the Defence Family Support or the Defence Support Worker within the school, and they provide an instrumental role between working with the parents, working with the children, and working with the staff. And they're really, a lot of their role is upskilling the staff to help them understand. So they're using our resources and other resources that they can get their hands on, and they're really providing an invaluable service. They're often the spouses of military members themselves, so they're living the dreams while they're actually supporting other people as well. And I think it's really important. And because you touched on a great point there, a lot more people in Australia, and I'm assuming in other Western countries, are living on those bases. And so it means that they're out in the more general population, and it means we have to build the capacity of everybody, society. So it's not just these specialized little places where they're getting supports. We need to upskill the whole community.
I have so many more questions I can ask, but I can't believe how fast the time has flown by with the two of you, and we are appreciative of their time. Is there any last kind of pieces you want to mention, some gaps that you see in the research or possible future opportunities to support families?
I think there's a lot of scope. As Dr. Rogers was saying earlier, we are a reasonably small research community in Australia in terms of comparatively perhaps to other countries that have bigger defence or military populations. I think there's excellent opportunity for us to work together really broadly, and probably, to be honest, for those that need the change, the more of us there are advocating for change, I think the more likely we're going to be able to support that. And I'd love to see more of that collaboration going forward. And from my perspective, I feel like we've done enough research into how much support is needed. We know that there is a level of support needed. So it's translating that, doing the things like Dr. Rogers is doing and putting the rubber on the road, if you like, in Australian terminology, and really getting things in place and providing that support. And I think that's really, really important that we push forward to keep doing that.
I agree, Dr. Post. There's just loads of gaps, especially in Australia. I can't speak for other countries, but it's almost like when you start, the area is so big and there's so much need. So for us, it's very much about that research translation and then finding out from parents, though, beforehand, what is it that you would like to see us write books about or modules about or something else outside of that? Would you like us to run this program face-to-face? Would that help you? Can we run a course for educators? Would that be something that might help you if the educators of these children understanding what military families experience? For me, I'm super passionate about that, about resources that supporting families, but I'm also passionate about not wasting time reinventing the wheel. So if I hear that Canada are doing this, I think, okay, how can I just support what they're doing and then adapt it for our audiences rather than saying, okay, let's just start from scratch in each country, because there's such limited times and there's such limited funds. And if we just pool our efforts and use a lot of in-kind funding and get the cash funding where we need it and only when we need it, we can build the capacity and we can work with our allies. We work together on the battlefield. Why can't we be working together in our home countries as well and really increase our capacity to support each other? Because we come from such a similar cultural background. There's beautiful differences, but there's so many similarities that we can be creating things together. Before I linked up with Simba and doing the wonderful work with Amy Doyle in Simba and really tapping into their amazing cultural translation, I was really writing for an Australian audience. But now I think, well, that's good in a way, but wouldn't it be better if we're all contributing to a book that can be used internationally? And so maybe we just do 2 versions and we just change the spelling, and really that's almost all we have to change, because that's cheaper and it's less time and it's less work, and it could help more children and support more families at different stages of the life course, like what Nicholas said. So at the moment, with our Endure storybook, it's actually being tested over in the UK by the King's College London Health Research Institute. And that means that we're getting international perspectives about the suitability of that and how we can adapt it before we release the final copy. So that piggybacking and working together to build capacity, I think, is so important. We're also looking at a book about relocations because, as I mentioned before, that's such a huge issue for families. And we're also looking at co-creating an international book on the positives of being in a service family and how they can realize those positives and use them during times of stress, build their coping skills as well. So that's sort of where we're headed, but we're always open to new ideas about the resources people want and new directions that we can go in and new collaborations.
And that's what I think is really important about it. As researchers, we actually have a duty to translate this and not just write a report, stick it on the shelf and move on to the next pot of funding, like you say. And I think one of the things that really sticks in my mind is a lot of the people that I work with are from the Vietnam era. And one family care partner is saying to me, we've been asked the same questions for 40 years and nothing has changed. And it's that we need to stop asking questions now and we need to start doing. And I'm not saying that people aren't doing, please don't take that the wrong way, but we need to really start that translation and really providing that support. And some of it is really practical things. Like we have family care partners who say they've got these amazing programs. They're all in business hours. My partner's away. My partner's deployed. I have 2 small children. There's no creche associated with this program. How would you like me to attend? That's something really practical that can be fixed really easily, but there just doesn't seem to be that level of thought to it in some cases. And I think those really simple practical things go a long way into having impact and making a difference.
That's a great point, Dr. Price. And I find with families that they're looking for ways to tap into different supports, and different things will search different people. And I love what you talk about with being practical and going beyond the research. I'm a participatory researcher, which means that the whole motto is that the data that I collect doesn't belong to me, and it's not going to go and sit on a Q1 journal and be behind a firewall that nobody can access, because as a participatory researcher, I am, even in my consent forms, I'm saying that I will not make any money out of the data that I publish. I will use that for the greater good. I will try and improve your lot in life if you will work with me as a researcher. That has changed my whole philosophy, and it makes me realize that for many, many years, people have just been asking questions of these families, but it doesn't really lead to anything that they can see. And maybe it does lead to something, but if they can't see that it leads to anything, then it's almost the same as not leading to something.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. I think the listeners of the Beyond the Battlefield podcast are really going to enjoy today's episode. I thank you both for your time. We really appreciate it, and all the insight and knowledge that you provide. So thank you for taking the time with us today.
Thanks for the opportunity.
It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you again to Dr. Post and Dr. Rogers. Please continue the conversation with us by following the CIMVR and the Journal of Military Veteran Family Health on Facebook and LinkedIn. Now that you've listened to the Beyond the Battlefield podcast, episode 4, we invite you to complete a short survey by clicking on the survey link in the podcast description section below. Your input helps us create content that's valuable to you. On next week's episode, we sit down with Dr. Rachel Gribble and Dr. Natalie Reed to discuss identity, community building, and lifestyle dimensions. You won't want to miss it. Thank you for taking the time to listen today. Please subscribe to the podcast and leave us a review. Until next time, take care and stay well. Goodbye for now.